"Give my dad the keys," my husband demanded, slamming his hand on the dining table. "He's moving into the master bedroom tomorrow." He stood in the middle of a home my parents had spent 20 years saving to buy for me, casually assigning rooms to his family as if he owned the place. His father smirked, reaching out his hand with insufferable entitlement, completely convinced I would break down and obey. My lawyer had urged me to fight them in court, but I didn't need a lawsuit. Instead, I stood up, looked my father-in-law dead in the eye, and uttered just one sentence. Instantly, the smug grin wiped off his face, and his skin went deathly pale. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into how a single sentence shattered their entire plan, comment the city you're watching from below, so I can see how far this story travels. My name is Clara, I'm 28 years old, and if there's one thing I learned growing up, it's that true sacrifice doesn't scream. It bleeds quietly in the background. For 20 years, my parents worked themselves to the bone. My dad was a welder whose hands were permanently stained with grease and burn scars, and my mom ran an elder care night shift that aged her far beyond her years. They didn't take vacations. They didn't buy new cars. Instead, every single dollar they earned went into a private fund with one clear purpose: securing a fully paid-off home for me, so I would never have to know the crippling fear of an unpaid mortgage or a ruthless landlord. 2 months ago, that dream became a reality. They handed me the keys to a stunning 4-bedroom house, completely debt-free. When I married Mark 2 years ago, I thought I was adding a partner to my life. Mark was charming, ambitious, and carried himself with an easy confidence. But beneath that polished exterior lay a subtle, insidious strand of entitlement. He didn't view my parents' 20 years of agonizing labor as a sacred gift to be respected. To Mark, my parents were just simple, working-class folks who had stumbled onto a gold mine, and he was the educated son-in-law who deserved to manage the yield. Slowly, the quiet comments started, hints that my house was our asset, and that my parents had been almost foolish for not investing it into his family's high-risk ventures instead. It all started on a crisp Saturday morning when Mark announced, almost as an afterthought, that his father, Richard, and his younger sister, Amber, were coming over for a casual visit. There was no asking, no checking if I had plans, just a sudden decree. When Richard walked through the front door, he didn't greet me with a hug or even a polite smile. Instead, his sharp, calculating eyes immediately began scanning the high ceilings, the crown molding, and the pristine hardwood floors. Richard was a man who had spent his entire life trying to project the image of a wealthy patriarch, despite a long history of disastrous business ventures and mounting debts. Within 10 minutes of stepping inside, the subtle disrespect turned into an outright invasion. He walked around running his fingers over my granite countertops, making passive-aggressive comments about how 2 people didn't need this much square footage. "It's practically a waste," Richard mused aloud, standing in the middle of our sunlit living room. "A grand house like this belongs to the head of a family, not just a young couple." Mark didn't defend me. Instead, he stood right beside his father, nodding like a loyal lieutenant eager to please his commander. "Dad's right, Clara," Mark said, his voice laced with a strange, dismissive authority I'd never heard before. "It's selfish for us to keep all these empty rooms to ourselves." That was when Richard walked straight up the stairs, uninvited, opened the door to our master suite, and began measuring the walls with a tape measure he'd brought in his pocket. He turned to me with a cold, smug grin and said, "This room gets the best morning light. It'll do nicely for my home office and bedroom." My heart dropped into my stomach as I watched Richard calmly pacing out the floor plan of my master bedroom. Before I could even voice my outrage, Mark grabbed my arm, not painfully but with a firm, controlling grip, and led me down the stairs into the kitchen. Richard and Amber followed closely behind, forming an intimidating semicircle around the granite kitchen island. The atmosphere in the room instantly turned suffocating, like a trap snapping shut. Mark leaned against the island, extended his open palm toward me, and said in a voice cold enough to freeze glass, "Give my dad the keys, Clara." He wasn't asking. It was a command. He went on to explain, with terrifying entitlement, that Richard would be moving into the master suite permanently, while Amber would take the second largest bedroom. Mark sneered, telling me I was being deeply selfish for hoarding my parents' hard work when his family needed a dignified place to live. He expected me to cave under the pressure of his father's imposing presence and hand over full residency rights. His family stood there smiling, treating my home like a conquered territory. But as Mark gestured frantically during his rant, his arm brushed against Richard's jacket, which was draped over the counter. A thick manila folder fell onto the polished floor, spilling its contents right at my feet. My eyes instantly caught the bold, red letterhead on the top page, an official notice of bank foreclosure, and a mountain of unpaid tax liens under Richard's name. In that exact moment, the fog cleared. I looked at Mark's expectant hand, unbuttoned my coat, looked Richard dead in the eye, and prepared to shatter their entire scheme. "You didn't come here for a family visit, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the room with absolute, icy calm. "You came here because the bank is auctioning off your house in 3 weeks to pay off $200,000 in tax fraud debts." The room went instantly dead silent. The smug, triumphant grins vanished from their faces as if struck by a physical blow. Richard's jaw dropped, and the tape measure he was still clutching slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. His face drained of all color, turning a ghostly, sickly gray. Beside him, Mark froze in place, his extended, demanding palm hovering awkwardly in the air before slowly dropping to his side. His arrogant posture collapsed in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, wide-eyed terror. He looked at his father, then back at me, realizing in a heartbeat that the quiet, submissive wife he thought he had cornered was entirely gone. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood my ground in the center of the kitchen my parents bought, watching the illusion of their superiority shatter into a million unsalvageable pieces. The power dynamic in that room didn't just shift, it flipped completely. They were no longer the conquerors demanding my home. They were exposed frauds standing exposed in the light of truth. I hadn't just gotten lucky, I was prepared. 2 days before their little surprise visit, a certified letter addressed to Richard had been delivered to my mailbox by mistake, bearing the stamp of the county sheriff's department. Driven by an uncomfortable hunch, I had taken it straight to my family's attorney. What he uncovered made my blood run cold. Richard was completely insolvent, drowning in reckless gambling debts and unpaid back taxes. Even worse, Mark had been secretly consulting a shady real estate lawyer behind my back. My husband's grand plan wasn't just to house his father. He intended to trick me into adding his name to the deed under the guise of marital equality. The moment his name was on that title, they planned to leverage my parents' hard-earned, paid-off house to take out a massive equity loan, effectively using my family's legacy as collateral to bail Richard out of his financial ruin. "How could you?" I whispered, looking directly at Mark, the man I had promised to love and protect. My parents bled for 20 years, so I would be secure. They worked 60-hour weeks in the freezing cold and scorching heat, while your father squandered every dime on casino trips and failed scams. And you were going to hand them my life on a silver platter? Mark stammered, his face flushing crimson as he tried to construct another lie. "Clara, please, it's not what it looks like. He's my dad. We were going to pay it back." But the web of deceit was fully unraveled, and his pathetic excuses fell flat against the cold, unyielding reality of their betrayal. Before Mark could open his mouth to offer another hollow excuse, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a second document, a formal, legally binding notice of trespass and an immediate lockout order, drafted by my attorney that very morning. "Richard, Amber," I said, my voice cutting through their panic like a razor blade. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house, or the officers parked down the street will come escort you off the property in handcuffs." Richard's face contorted into a mix of shock and utter humiliation. Without saying a single word, he grabbed his tape measure, snatched his jacket off the counter, and practically sprinted toward the front door, with Amber scurrying right behind him. The great, arrogant patriarch was leaving in absolute disgrace. Then I turned to Mark. He stood there trembling, the reality of his shattered scheme finally crashing down on him. "Clara, baby, please," he whimpered, taking a desperate step toward me, his hands shaking. "I was just trying to help my family. I love you. We can fix this." "Your family?" I asked, looking at him with complete detachment. "My parents are my family. You are a predator who brought wolves into the home they built for me." I walked over to the front door, pulled it wide open, and pointed outside. "Your clothes are already packed in the garage. Get out of my house, Mark. We are done." He tried to reach for my hand, but the cold, unyielding look in my eyes told him there was no coming back. He walked out, and the door slammed shut forever. 3 months have passed since that morning, and the silence in my home has never felt more peaceful. The divorce was finalized smoothly, as the overwhelming evidence of Mark's attempted fraud left his lawyers with zero leverage to demand a single cent of my property. Richard's house was foreclosed on, and Mark is now living in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment with his father and sister, struggling to pay off the massive legal debts they brought upon themselves. Meanwhile, I spent last weekend planting a garden in the backyard with my parents. Watching my dad's scarred hands pressing soil around fresh rose bushes, I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. They gave up their youth so I could have a future, and I protected that sacrifice with everything I had. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what is rightfully yours. True family builds you up. They don't tear down your walls to shelter themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to set strict boundaries with entitled in-laws? Tell me your story, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.